In the frozen heart of the Dakota Territory, 1876, a young woman lay bleeding and broken next to her newborn twins. She was abandoned in a decaying cabin by the man who once swore she was his entire world. He had left her with no food, no firewood, and no hope. He'd left her to the mercy of the blizzard and the whispers in town that claimed she'd gone mad. With every fading cry from her children, she knew their fate was sealed. But just as the cold began to steal her final breath, a shadow moved through the snow. A lone Lakota hunter who spoke no words but simply took her children in his arms and lifted her onto his shoulders. What happened next would forever silence the people who had once mocked her. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. The wind screamed like a wounded beast, its claws scraping at the cracks in the dilapidated cabin with the persistence of an ancient hunger. Eleanor Vance clenched her jaw as another contraction ripped through her exhausted body, biting down on the strip of leather she'd wedged between her teeth to keep from screaming. Not because anyone would hear her. There wasn't a living soul for miles. But to scream would be to surrender to the terror, and terror was a luxury she could not afford. "Damn you, Silas," she rasped as the pain subsided, leaving her gasping on the rough-hewn cot. "Damn you for your silver-tongued promises." It had been 3 weeks since her husband had ridden off toward the nearest settlement promising supplies, medicine, and with that charming grin that had once bewitched her, a midwife for the coming birth. "I'll be back before you can miss me, my love," he had said, kissing her forehead with a touch as light as a lie. "You just take care of my legacy." His legacy. As if he were some great landowner, and not a wandering dreamer who had dragged her from a comfortable life in Ohio with tales of fertile land and endless opportunity. As if this miserable shack with its leaking roof and walls that barely held back the razor-sharp Dakota wind was a great estate to be proud of. Another contraction seized her, more violent than the last. This time Eleanor couldn't choke back the cry. The sound was swallowed by the timber walls and lost in the vast, white emptiness that surrounded her. No one was listening. No one was coming. With an effort that felt superhuman, Eleanor pushed herself up and fed another piece of the floorboard into the stove. The fire was weak, a pathetic flicker fed by the last scraps of wood she'd been able to pry loose. She'd already burned a chair and half of the table. If the labor dragged on, she would have to choose between warmth and shelter and start burning the very beams that held the roof above her head. "He isn't coming back," she said aloud, finally giving voice to the truth she had been avoiding for days. "You were always too smart to fall for his lies, Eleanor Vance. And yet here you are." The pain returned, a deep, bearing down pressure that told her the moment was here. There was no more time for regret. Eleanor positioned herself as best she could, remembering the births she had witnessed back home. She had been the daughter of a botanist, not a midwife. But in a small Ohio town, everyone learned the basics of bringing life into the world. What no one had ever told her was how to do it alone in a freezing cabin in the middle of nowhere with a north wind threatening to tear the roof from over her head. The next few hours blurred into a haze of agony, determination, and moments of almost supernatural clarity. Eleanor worked methodically despite the fear, focusing only on the next step, the next breath, the next push. When she finally held her first child, a small boy with surprisingly powerful lungs, tears of relief and sorrow streamed down her face. There was no time to process the emotion. His sister was already on her way. Minutes later a girl joined her brother, her cry softer but just as vital. Twins? Silas hadn't even suspected. She hadn't even suspected. With hands that shook from a combination of exhaustion and awe, Eleanor cut the cords with her husband's hunting knife, which she had painstakingly boiled in melted snow. She cleaned the infants as best she could with rags, and what was left of a linen sheet, then wrapped them in the last of her clean clothes and a shirt Silas had left behind. Arthur, she murmured, naming the boy for her own father, a steady, reliable man who would be appalled at her current state. And Lily, she added, for the wild lilies that grew near her childhood home, a symbol of resilience and beauty in a harsh world. The effort of the birth had consumed the last of her energy. Eleanor knew she needed to eat, but the larder was a cruel joke. A handful of flour, a strip of rancid bacon, and a few withered potatoes. It was all that remained after weeks of waiting for Silas' return. She carefully placed the twins together on the cot and dragged herself to the cupboard. The world swayed dangerously around her, and then she saw the blood. Too much blood soaking her dress and pooling on the dirt floor. No, not now, she whispered, the words both a command and a plea. You can't die now, Eleanor. They need you. Using her final reserves of strength, she crawled to a small chest where she kept dried herbs her father had taught her about. She wasn't a healer, but she knew willow bark could help with fever and that yarrow was said to slow bleeding. With trembling hands she brewed a crude, bitter tea and forced it down, ignoring the way it churned in her empty stomach. Outside, the snow began to fall with renewed fury. The wind moaned through the nearby pines, a sound that had once seemed beautiful to her but now only amplified her profound isolation. Night was falling, and with it came the deep, unforgiving cold of a Dakota winter. Eleanor looked at her newborns. They were so small, so fragile. In any other circumstance, their birth would be a cause for celebration, for neighbors to arrive with warm food and well wishes, for a proud father to boast of his ace. Instead, they had a mother who was bleeding to death, a cabin that was slowly being consumed for fuel, and the constant, gnawing threat of starvation and cold. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her fingers gently tracing their perfect, rosy cheeks. I am so sorry. It was unfair to apologize for bringing them into this cruel world. But what more could she offer them? What hope was there for a life that began in such desolation? Time became a blur of semi-consciousness. Eleanor drifted between lucid moments of tending to the babies, feeding the fire and trying to eat something herself, and longer frightening periods of feverish confusion. The bleeding had slowed, but the weakness was profound. She knew with the chilling clarity that sometimes accompanies the proximity of death that she was fighting a losing battle. The days bled into one another. The snow never stopped, sealing the cabin in a white, suffocating silence. Eleanor rationed the meager food that remained, prioritizing staying just strong enough to nurse the twins. She burned the rest of the furniture, then the small stack of books she had brought from Ohio, keepsakes of her educated past. She kept only her mother's Bible, not out of faith. She had long ago stopped expecting miracles, but as a final link to the life she had given up. One morning, or perhaps it was afternoon, she no longer knew, Eleanor awoke to a cold that pierced her to the bone. The fire had gone out during one of her brief, fitful naps. The twins were whimpering, weakly, cold and hungry. With mechanical movements, Eleanor crawled to the stove. There was no more wood. Her eyes scanned the small room, assessing what else could burn. Her gaze fell on the cradle that Silas had built in a rare moment of paternal foresight. "I suppose you'll never use it anyway," she murmured, her voice a dry crackle from disuse and dehydration. Using a small hatchet with weak but precise swings, she dismantled the cradle. The dry pine caught quickly, providing a temporary warmth that felt like an obscene luxury. She nursed the twins, noting with a sick sense of dread that her milk was diminishing. Without proper food, her body was shutting down. Soon she would have nothing to give them. One more day, she promised herself. Wait one more day, and maybe the storm will break. But a glance at the cabin's single window showed only a wall of falling white. The howl of the wind was a constant drone now, an indifferent witness to their suffering. That night, as the last piece of the cradle turned to ash in the stove, Eleanor made a decision. She laid the twins together on the cot, bundling them as best she could. Then she lay down beside them, covering them with her own body. If the fire could no longer keep them alive, perhaps her own body heat could, at least for a few more hours. "I'm so sorry I brought you to this place," she whispered, kissing their tiny heads. "If I had known, if I had only seen Silas for who he truly was." But regret was a useless currency now. All that mattered were these two tiny beings who, against all odds, were still breathing. "I don't know if anyone is listening," Eleanor murmured, closing her eyes. "I was never as devout as my mother wished, but if there is something out there, I don't ask you to save me. Just them. Please just give them a chance." The silence that followed her prayer was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor felt a strange peace settle over her, as if she had finally accepted the inevitable. It would be so easy now to just let go, to surrender to the sleep that promised an end to the pain and the cold. A sound pulled her from the fog. At first she thought it was her imagination, or maybe the crack of ice on a nearby tree. But there it was again. Something different. Something she hadn't heard in weeks. The crunch of footsteps outside the cabin, heavy feet compressing the snow with a rhythmic, purposeful tread. Eleanor tried to sit up, but her body refused to obey. She tried to call out, but her voice was only a whisper of air. The steps stopped right outside the door. There was a pause, and then the unmistakable sound of someone clearing away the drifted snow. Had Silas finally returned? Was it a lost trapper? Or perhaps one of the settlers who supposedly lived miles away? Or was it something worse? The Lakota that Silas had always spoken of with such fear, filling her head with stories of raids and captures. The door creaked open, and Eleanor gathered the last of her strength to clutch her children to her chest. If this was the end, at least she would die trying to protect them. A figure wrapped in furs stepped into the cabin. The faint light filtering through the snow-caked window illuminated a weathered face. Tanned skin, dark, unreadable eyes, and a long, faded scar that ran down his right cheek. It wasn't Silas. It wasn't any settler she had ever seen. He was a native man, a Lakota, judging by his clothing and the way his hair was braided. Their eyes met across the shadowy room. There was no expression in his gaze, not pity, not malice, just a quiet assessment of what he saw. A dying white woman and two fading newborns. Eleanor wanted to speak, to plead for her children's lives, if not her own, but the darkness was closing in around her. The last thing she saw before she lost consciousness was the man moving slowly toward the cot, his hand outstretched toward the twins. Please, she managed to whisper before the world dissolved into blackness. Please. And then there was only silence. The white woman's whisper faded into the frigid air as her eyes fluttered shut. Kanu remained motionless for a moment, observing the way consciousness drained from her pale, hollowed face. The plea, though uttered in a language he barely understood, was universal. The desperate cry of a mother for her young. The silence that followed was deep, broken only by the woman's shallow breathing and the faint, gurgling whimpers of the two infants she cradled. Kano approached cautiously. The babies, so small they seemed barely formed, trembled visibly. Their lips had a bluish tint that he knew all too well. Without warmth they would not last the hour, let alone the night. A voice inside him urged him to turn back, to leave the cabin and continue on his way. These were not his people. This woman belonged to the world that had brought death and misery to his own, the people whose diseases had stolen his wife Anpaitu and his little daughter Winona. It had been 3 winters now. But another voice, deeper and more ancient, reminded him of his grandfather's teachings. Cruelty to the helpless poisons a warrior's spirit. And these creatures, this dying mother and her newborn children, were as helpless as any could be. With a sigh that carried the weight of years of pain and conflict, Kano made his choice. He removed his heavy buffalo hide coat and gently draped it over the woman and her children. Then, with swift, efficient movements, he went to the cold stove. The metal was icy to the touch, not the faintest trace of residual heat. He looked around for fuel but found only ash and the charred fragments of what looked to have once been furniture. This woman had burned everything she had to survive. A reluctant respect stirred within him. Survival demanded that kind of resolve. Kano left the cabin and returned moments later, his arms laden with dry branches from a cache he kept on his Travos, the sled he used to transport his belongings. He kindled a fire with the practiced skill of a lifetime, feeding it first with small twigs and then with larger pieces until a healthy flame danced in the stove. The warmth began to spread slowly through the one-room cabin. Kano approached the woman and children again, his gaze clinical as he assessed their condition. The woman had lost a great deal of blood. The dark stains on the cot and floor testified to it, and her breathing was shallow. The infants, though weak, were responding to the growing warmth with more vigorous movements and stronger cries. Carefully, Kano lifted the babies and brought them closer to the fire, keeping them swaddled in their makeshift blankets. He remembered the way Anpaitu had held their newborn, Winona, humming softly as she rocked her to sleep. The memory brought a sharp stab of pain, but he pushed it away. This was not the time to be lost in ghosts. He returned to his travois and retrieved a leather pouch of medicinal herbs. He was no medicine man, but any lone hunter learned to treat common wounds and illnesses. Among the herbs he found what he was looking for: willow bark for the fever and yarrow to help stop the bleeding. Outside, he scooped clean snow into a skin container and set it near the fire to melt. Once the water was warm, he prepared 2 infusions, one with the bark and one with the root. The bitter, earthy aroma filled the small cabin. With deliberately slow movements, he approached the woman again. She was still unconscious, but her forehead was hot with fever. Kano wet a piece of cloth in the fresh water and laid it on her brow. Then, with extreme gentleness, he lifted her head and brought the container of infusion to her lips. "Drink," he said in his own tongue, knowing she wouldn't understand the word but hoping the tone would convey his intent. "Live, little mother." At first the liquid just wet her chapped lips. But then by instinct the woman began to swallow. Kano continued to administer the medicine in tiny sips until she had taken half of the container. He laid her head down again and turned his attention to the infants. They were hungry, that much was clear. Their tiny mouths rooted about with desperate motions. He knew that without their mother's milk they would not last long. He had seen the women of his tribe nurse orphaned babies with a mixture of animal fat and bone marrow thinned with warm water. It wasn't ideal, but it might keep them alive until their mother recovered. If she recovered. With his knife Kano shaved thin slivers of dried meat from his personal supply, chewing them until they were soft and then steeping them in warm water. The fat dissolved, creating a nourishing broth. He dipped a clean corner of buckskin into the liquid and offered the wet tip to the first baby's mouth. The boy latched on instinctively, his tiny fists clenching with apparent satisfaction. Kano repeated the process with the girl, who seemed weaker but was just as determined to feed. While he tended to the infants, Kano took in the cabin in more detail. It was a poor structure, ill-prepared for a Dakota winter. Cracks between the logs let in drafts of icy air, and the roof looked ready to give way under the weight of the accumulated snow. Who would leave a pregnant woman in such a place? The question sparked a quiet rage that surprised him with its intensity. After the babies were fed, he returned them to their mother's side, ensuring they were wrapped snugly for warmth but not too tightly. Then, with practical efficiency, he set about repairing the cabin's most urgent flaws. He used a mixture of mud and dried grass to chink the larger cracks between the logs. He braced a sagging roof beam with a sturdy branch. He cleared the heavy snow from the roof by pushing up from the inside with a long pole, relieving the weight without damaging the structure. The physical work was a welcome distraction from the whirlwind of thoughts and conflicting emotions that assailed him. A part of him still questioned his decision to help. Another part knew he could not have done otherwise. He was so absorbed in his work that he almost didn't notice when the woman began to stir. A low moan alerted him, and he turned to see her trying to sit up, her eyes open but unfocused. "The babies," she mumbled. The English word was one of the few Kano recognized. "My children." He approached slowly, holding his empty hands out, palms up, in a universal gesture of peace. The woman saw him, and fear flared in her eyes with a force that seemed impossible for someone in her condition. She scrambled toward the infants and shielded them with her body, glaring at Kano with terror but also with a fierce resolve. "No," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "Don't you hurt them." Kano stopped keeping his distance. He understood her fear. To the settlers, the Lakota were devils, incarnate boogeyman stories to frighten children. He pointed to the blazing stove, then to the mud-sealed walls, and finally to the container that had held the medicinal infusion. "Help," he said in his broken English. It was one of the few words he had learned from a half-breed trader years ago. "Kano, help." Confusion began to replace some of the fear in the woman's eyes. She looked around, noticing for the first time the changes in the cabin, the warmth that now enveloped her, the fact that she and her children were still alive. You lit the fire?" she asked slowly, as if each word required a monumental effort. Kano nodded, then pointed to the babies and to her. "Live," he said. Another word from his limited vocabulary. "Won't live." The tension in the woman's body eased slightly, though she still kept a protective arm around her children. Her eyes fluttered shut for a moment as if gathering strength, and when she opened them again something was different. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first glimmer of understanding. Eleanor, she said, touching her own chest. My name is Eleanor. Kano nodded again in acknowledgement. He touched his own chest in turn. Kano, he repeated. Eleanor seemed to consider this, her gaze assessing the man before her with new attention. Kano knew what she saw. A Lakota warrior in middle life, his long black hair parted and braided, dressed in buckskin and fur, a long knife at his belt, and the marks of battle on his facete scar that ran from his right eye to his jaw, a gift from a cavalry saber. My children, she said, finally moving aside just enough to reveal the babies. Arthur and Lily. Kano approached, his movements slow and deliberate. He knelt at a respectful distance, looking at the infants, who were now sleeping, seemingly content from their improvised meal. Little warriors, he said in Lakota heartfelt compliment. Eleanor didn't understand the words, but something in his tone must have conveyed his intent, for she nodded slightly. They were born during the storm, she explained, her voice still weak. I was alone. My husband, he's been gone for weeks. Kano didn't understand all the details, but he grasped the essentials. She had been alone when the children came. The admiration he had begun to feel for her deepened. Even the strongest women of his tribe rarely endured an unsupported birth, and never twins. Eleanor swayed slightly, the effort of conversation draining her scarce reserves. Kano moved instinctively to steady her, but stopped himself when he saw her tense up again. Instead of moving closer, he pointed to the container of medicine and then to her. Drink, he said. Good medicine. With a trembling hand, Eleanor took the container. She sniffed it with suspicion, but the desperation of her situation must have outweighed her fear, because she took a tentative sip. Her face puckered at the bitterness, but she continued to drink until the container was empty. Thank you, she said at last, the words barely audible. Kano inclined his head in acceptance of her gratitude. Then he rose and went back to his work, giving the woman space to process everything that had happened. He refueled the fire and then went to the window, assessing the weather. The snow was still falling and the wind had picked up. It was not a good time to travel, but the cabin would need supplies if they were to survive more than another day. He made his decision. With gestures and a few English words, he knew he communicated to Eleanor that he was going hunting. Fear returned to her eyes, and Kano understood. She was afraid he would abandon her just as her husband had. He made a circular gesture with his finger and then pointed back at the cabin, promising to return. Kano, come back. Bring food. Eleanor nodded slowly, mistrust warring with need on her face. She had little choice. Without him, she and her children would perish before morning. Kano gathered his bow, arrows, and hunting knife, wrapped himself in his furs and stepped out into the blizzard, closing the door firmly behind him. The journey through the blizzard was treacherous. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he was accustomed to it. He had survived wars since choosing a life of solitude after his family's death. He moved with a quiet skill honed since childhood, searching for any sign of life. Despite the storm, animals needed to eat. He found the tracks of a rabbit near a thicket of brush and positioned himself with endless patience, waiting. His patience was rewarded when a good-sized jackrabbit appeared for a brief moment. An arrow flew with lethal precision, and a few minutes later Kano had secured the first real food the cabin had seen in days. He continued hunting, finding another rabbit, and in a stroke of incredible luck a young deer that had become trapped in a deep snowdrift. The meat would last them for many days if preserved properly. The return to the cabin was grueling, carrying his prize through snow that in some places came up to his knees. The storm had worsened, reducing visibility to only a few feet. Kano navigated by instinct and memory, following his own half-erased tracks. When he finally spotted the faint outline of the cabin, a knot of tension in his chest that he hadn't even been aware of began to loosen. He found himself quickening his pace, an unfamiliar anxiety about what he might find inside stirring within him. When he opened the door, he was met with silence. For one terrifying moment he feared the worst. But then he heard the soft coo of one of the babies and saw Eleanor, still weak but conscious, trying to soothe little Lily. The relief on her face when she saw him enter was unmistakable. "You came back," she said, as if she hadn't truly believed he would. Kano nodded, depositing his hunt near the stove. Without wasting a moment he began to skin and clean the rabbit. Soon fresh meat was simmering in a makeshift pot he had fashioned from a metal bucket he found in the cabin. He added herbs from his pouch to the broth, enriching its flavor and medicinal properties. As the afternoon wore on, marked by the constant howl of the wind and the comforting crackle of the fire, he methodically processed the deer as well, preserving as much of the meat as he could. Eleanor dozed intermittently, waking to tend to the babies when they cried. During those moments Kano discreetly turned his attention to other tasks, giving her privacy. When the broth was ready, Kano filled a bowl and brought it to Eleanor. She accepted it with trembling hands, inhaling the rich aroma with obvious appreciation. "It smells wonderful," she said, taking a careful sip of the hot liquid. Her eyes closed for a moment in an expression of pure bliss. "Thank you. Thank you for all of this." Kano just inclined his head, accepting her gratitude without words. He served himself a portion and sat at a respectful distance, watching as color slowly began to return to Eleanor's cheeks. The cabin felt different now. Not comfortable exactly, but more like a shelter than a tomb in waiting. The silence between them wasn't easy. It was weighted with mistrust and a history of cultural conflict, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of a truce, of a mutually recognized necessity. "Why are you helping me?" Eleanor asked finally, her voice stronger after the meal. "Why risk yourself for us?" The question didn't surprise Kano. It was the same one he had been asking himself since he decided to stay. He searched for the words in English, but his vocabulary was too limited to express the complexity of his motives. Instead of speaking, he pointed to the children and then gestured toward the sky, a motion that in his culture symbolized a connection to the sacred, to the spirit world. "Children," he said in his simple English. "Sacred?" Eleanor seemed to consider this, her gaze shifting between the babies and the man who had saved them. "Do you have children?" she asked, her voice soft. The question was an arrow straight to his heart. Kano visibly tensed, and some of his pain must have shown on his face because Eleanor immediately looked remorseful. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have asked." Kano closed his eyes briefly, seeing Anpaitu's face, hearing Winona's laugh. When he opened them again, he touched his own chest and then gestured toward the horizon beyond the walls of the cabin. "Had," he said. "No more." Understanding dawned on Eleanor's face, followed by a wave of empathy that transcended the barriers between them. A parent's grief was universal regardless of skin color or spoken tongue. "I'm so sorry," she repeated. And this time Kano knew she truly meant it. He nodded once in acceptance of her words, then deflected from the painful subject by gesturing to the raging storm outside. How long he managed conveying his question. "I don't know," she answered. "The storms here can last for days." Kano surveyed the cabin with a critical eye. He had done what he could, but the structure was fundamentally weak. The roof would collapse eventually, maybe even that night if the snow continued at this intensity. Using gestures and drawings on the dirt floor, he tried to explain to Eleanor that the cabin was no longer safe. He pointed to the creaking beams, the dangerously sagging roof, the walls that barely held back the wind. "I know," she said, a frown of worry creasing her brow. "But we have nowhere to go." Kano considered his options. He knew of a shelter, a cave in the hills, a half-day's journey from here. It was dry, protected from the wind. He had used it himself the previous winter. But getting there meant traveling through the blizzard with a weakened woman and two newborn infants. The risk was enormous. But staying meant almost certain death when the cabin finally gave way. With deliberate gestures, Kano described the cave. Eleanor watched him intently, her eyes sharp with understanding. "A cave?" she asked. "You want to take us to a cave?" Kano nodded. He then pointed to the ceiling and mimed it collapsing. "Danger," he said. "Danger here." As if to punctuate his words, a particularly strong gust of wind shook the cabin so violently that the beams groaned ominously. Dust and small clumps of snow fell from the ceiling, landing on the cot where the babies slept. Eleanor shielded them instinctively, fear stark on her face. "When?" she asked, her voice tense. "When do we have to leave?" Kano pointed to the window where the darkness was now nearly complete. The night and the storm would make the journey suicidal. He then pointed to where the east would be, signaling the dawn. "Tomorrow," Eleanor confirmed with a nod of understanding. That settled. They both fell into silence again. Kano occupied himself with preparing for the journey. He fashioned extra skins to shield them from the cold, packed easily transportable provisions, adapted his travois to carry the infants and Eleanor herself if necessary. As he worked, he was aware of Eleanor's gaze following his movements. The initial mistrust had been replaced by something more complex. Caution, yes, but also curiosity and a reluctant respect. For his part, Kano found himself seeing this white woman in a new light. He had always seen settlers as invaders, usurpers of the land, and enemies who had destroyed his family. But this woman, abandoned, fighting for her children with a fierce determination, challenged the simplicity of that view. The night wore on and the storm raged. The wind howled like a wounded animal, shaking the cabin to its very foundations. The ceiling creaked ominously under the weight of the accumulating snow. Every sound made Eleanor flinch, her gaze darting instinctively to the ceiling and then to her children. "I don't think it's going to last until dawn," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. Kano followed her gaze to where a main beam had begun to bow dangerously. He nodded in agreement. The look on his face must have communicated the gravity of the situation, because Eleanor immediately began to gather the babies, wrapping them more tightly in their few blankets. "We have to go now, don't we?" she said, more a statement than a question. Kano nodded again. The decision was made. He finished preparing the travois, ensuring it would provide maximum protection from the elements. Then, gesturing for Eleanor to watch, he demonstrated how he would secure the infants, creating a small, sheltered cocoon with buffalo hides and flexible branches. Eleanor watched him, her eyes a mixture of fear and resolve. When he finished his demonstration, she said, simply, "I trust you." The words were so simple yet so profound that they echoed in Kano's chest. What must it have cost this woman to say them? How many prejudices and fears had she to overcome to place her life and the lives of her children in the hands of a savage, as his people were called? With a nod of acknowledgement that went far beyond words, Kano began the final preparations for their departure. The journey ahead would be perilous, potentially fatal. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the Dakota night was as relentless an enemy as any hostile warrior. And yet, as he watched Eleanor clutch her babies to her chest, whispering words of comfort to them in a language he didn't understand, Kano felt something he hadn't experienced in a long, long time. A sense of purpose. Not simply the grim determination to survive another day, but the certainty that his actions had meaning, that he was exactly where he needed to be in that moment. With one last ominous groan, the main roof beam gave way, partially sending a cascade of snow and wood splinters down near the dying fire. There was no more time for hesitation. Kano secured the makeshift shelter he had built on the travois, lining it with furs and designing it to protect the infants from the wind and biting snow. "Now," he said, his voice firm despite his limited English, nodding to the babies and then to the travois, indicating to Eleanor that it was time to place them inside. Eleanor, pale but resolute, wrapped the twins in the best blankets they had, including one Kano had sacrificed from his own gear. She kissed their small foreheads before handing them to the Lakota man with hands that barely trembled. "Be careful," she whispered, though she knew he didn't need the warning. In the few days she had known him, she had seen the surprising gentleness with which his weathered hands treated her children. Kano placed the infants in the shelter with precise movements, ensuring they were close enough to share body heat but with enough room to breathe comfortably. He added a leather pouch filled with stones he had heated in the fire, a trick his people used to keep newborns warm during winter transport. When he was done, he turned to Eleanor. He assessed her with a critical eye, noting her pallor, the weak way she stood, the slight tremor in her limbs. She was not yet recovered from childbirth and blood loss. The journey would be brutal for her. With gestures and his limited vocabulary, he told her to cover herself in as many layers as possible. He gave her a pair of rabbit fur mittens he had made and showed her how to wrap her face, leaving only her eyes exposed. "I pull," he said, indicating the travois, and then extending a leather strap to show how he would sling it over his shoulders to pull the load. Eleanor nodded, understanding the logistics. "What if I get too tired?" she asked, aware of her own weakness. Kano seemed to understand her concern. With a series of gestures, he explained that she could ride on the travois if need be, though it would make the journey slower and more difficult. "I'll try," she promised, her chin set with renewed determination. "I can walk." Kano looked at her with something that might have been respect, and then to Eleanor's surprise he held out his open hand to her. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she had been taught about the wild Lakota, that for a moment she could only stare at it in confusion. "Together," he said simply, his palm still extended. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat and placed her hand in his. Together, she repeated the word a covenant, a promise, and a choice all in one. With the final preparations complete, they left the cabin that had been both Eleanor's refuge and her prison. The wind hit them instantly, stealing their breath with its icy ferocity. The snow drove in horizontal sheets, reducing visibility to a few feet. Kano slung the travois strap over his shoulder, taking the load with the practiced strength of a man who had spent his life in the harshness of the plains. He took Eleanor by the arm, offering her support as they pushed into the wind, their feet sinking into the deep snow with every step. They didn't speak as they walked. The wind made any conversation impossible, and none was needed. They both understood the gravity of their situation. To have stayed meant certain death. To go on offered only a slim chance of survival. The world was reduced to a howling white expanse. Only the presence of Kano at her side, solid as a rock against the storm, kept Eleanor from surrendering to panic. Periodically he would stop to check on the infants, ensuring they were still protected and breathing well. In those moments Eleanor marveled at the transformation. The stoic, unreadable face of the warrior would soften just slightly as he checked on the children, and an unexpected gentleness guided his actions. They had been walking for what felt like an eternity when Eleanor stumbled for the first time. Her legs, still weak from the recent birth, and days of near starvation, gave out from under her. Kano caught her before she fell, his hand a firm grip on her arm. "Keep moving," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Do not stop." Eleanor nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. To stop in these conditions meant surrendering to the cold, letting the snow cover them until they became just another part of the winter landscape. They pressed on, each step a small victory against the elements. Time lost all meaning, measured only by the burning in her lungs and the crunch of snow underfoot. Eleanor focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on ignoring the aching cold that was setting into her bones and the numbness that was creeping up from her fingers. From time to time she could hear the faint whimpers of the twins from within the travois. The sounds, though they indicated discomfort, also confirmed that they were still alive, fighting just as she was against the impossible odds. The storm seemed to intensify as they progressed, as if nature itself was set against their will to survive. At one point the travois became wedged in a particularly deep snowdrift. Kano stopped to assess the situation with practiced calm. He motioned for Eleanor to come closer and indicated for her to hold the strap for a moment while he freed the sled. It was in that exact moment that the worst happened. As he transferred the strap, Kano let go of the travois for a split second. A particularly vicious gust of wind caught it, tipping it partially on its side. The infants, who had been relatively quiet, began to wail, their cries barely audible through the howl of the wind. Panic flooded Eleanor. She tried to run toward the travois, but the deep snow held her back. Kano, however, reacted with the speed and precision of a seasoned hunter. In the blink of an eye he was at the travois's side, righting it and checking on the babies, who miraculously were still secure in the shelter he had so carefully prepared. "Okay," he said, checking on each baby before turning his attention to Eleanor. "They are okay." The relief made Eleanor's knees buckle, and she would have collapsed into the snow had Kano not been at her side in an instant, holding her up. "No rest," he said, his voice more firm now. "Death in snow." Eleanor knew he was right. She had heard stories of travelers found frozen solid, their faces peaceful as if they had simply fallen asleep. The cold was a deceptive killer offering a comforting numbness before it claimed you. With renewed determination she pushed herself to her feet and they continued on. Kano adjusted their course slightly guided by signs in the landscape that were invisible to Eleanor. His ability to navigate in such conditions seemed almost supernatural, though she supposed it was simply the result of a lifetime spent reading the land, interpreting signs invisible to the untrained eye. Slowly the blackness of night began to yield to a pale grey that hinted at the approaching dawn. With the growing light, Eleanor could make out the landscape around them for the first time. Rolling, snow-covered hills, lone trees bent by the wind, and in the far distance the stark silhouette of what looked like low cliffs. Kano pointed toward them. "There," he said. "Cave." The destination was in sight, but it still seemed impossibly far away. Eleanor could feel her strength waning with every step. The cold had seeped deep into her bones, and every breath was a painful effort. That's when they heard the howl. Not of the wind. This sound was sharper, more deliberate, and it sent a chill down Eleanor's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Kano stopped abruptly, tensed like a drawn bow. His hand went to his hunting knife, and his gaze swept the landscape with a new intensity. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. "Wolves," Kano replied, his voice low and intense. "Hungry wolves." Eleanor had heard the stories of wolf packs that would follow travelers in the winter, waiting patiently for the cold or exhaustion to weaken them enough. She instinctively clutched the travois as if her body could shield the infants from this new danger. Kano motioned for her to stay still. They listened intently. The howl was repeated, closer this time, followed by another that seemed to come from a different direction. The pack was communicating, coordinating. With deliberate but quick movements, Kano opened a small pouch at his belt, took out what looked like a handful of red powder and sprinkled it in a circle around them and the travois. Then, to Eleanor's astonishment, he let out a low, guttural sound from deep in his throat, a call that was not quite human and not quite animal, but something in between. The sound echoed in the frigid air, and for a few seconds the wind itself seemed to quiet, as if listening. Then silence. The howling had stopped. What did you do?" Eleanor whispered in amazement. Kano gestured to the pouch he had put away. "Red pepper," he replied. "And a warning." Seeing her confused look, he added, "Wolves respect territory. I marked our territory." They waited for another long moment, listening for any sound from the pack, but the howls did not return. With a gesture, Kano indicated that they should press on, moving more quickly now. Eleanor followed him, torn between her fear of the wolves and a growing admiration for this man who seemed to have an answer for every danger they faced. It was as if nature, which for her was a constant threat, was for him a language he spoke fluently. They pushed on with a new sense of urgency. The sun, though invisible behind the heavy snow clouds, had risen enough to illuminate the landscape. Eleanor could now see the terrain better, the subtle shifts in the snow that had been invisible before. The cliffs were getting closer. Kano pointed to a specific formation where a rocky outcrop created a deeper shadow. "Cave there," he said. "Not far now." The words were a balm to Eleanor's frayed nerves. The promise of shelter, of warmth, of rest gave her renewed strength. But as she tried to quicken her pace, her body, pushed far beyond its limits, finally betrayed her. Her legs gave out completely, and this time she could not get back up. "I'm sorry," she gasped, shame mixing with her utter exhaustion. I can't. Without a word, Kano unslung the strap of the travois, and in one fluid motion lifted Eleanor into his arms. He was far stronger than his lean frame suggested, and he held her against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all. I carry, he said simply. You rest. She wanted to protest, to tell him he couldn't possibly carry both her and the babies, but the warmth of his body against the invasive cold was too comforting and her exhaustion was too profound. She closed her eyes, allowing herself for the first time since the birth to be completely dependent on another. She didn't know how long she was carried like that, drifting in and out of a state of semi-consciousness. The steady rhythm of Kano's footsteps and the warmth of his chest against her cheek created a sense of security she hadn't felt since, well, perhaps since she was a child in her father's arms. When she opened her eyes again, the landscape had changed. They were ascending a gradual slope toward the cliffs. The snow was less deep here, scarred away by the wind against the rock face. Kano moved with sure feet, pulling the travois with one arm while he held her with the other. I can walk now, Eleanor said, aware of the extra effort he was expending. Kano looked at her briefly, assessing her condition, and then nodded, setting her gently on her feet. Her legs trembled as they took her weight, but they held firm. Close, he said, pointing to a fissure in the rock wall that was becoming visible as they neared. Cave there. Indeed, what had looked from a distance like just another shadow on the rock face turned out to be the entrance to a natural cave. The opening was tall enough for them to enter without stooping, but narrow enough to provide a good shield from the wind. As soon as they crossed the stone threshold, the howl of the storm diminished to a distant whisper. Eleanor blinked her eyes, adjusting to the dimness. The cave was deeper than she had expected, extending several yards into the hillside. The ground was surprisingly dry, and the air, though cold, lacked the cutting moisture of the outdoors. Kano maneuvered the travois inside and immediately set about making camp. With an efficiency born of experience, he arranged skins on the ground to create an insulating layer from the cold rock. He then built a small stone ring near the entrance, a hearth for the fire that would provide warmth without choking them with smoke. Eleanor, for her part, tended to the babies. To her immense relief, though they were clearly uncomfortable and hungry, they showed no signs of frostbite. Their tiny limbs were still pink and warm, their breathing even. The shelter on the travois had done its job. Thank you, she said, watching Kano as he skillfully started a fire with tinder and flint. We wouldn't have survived without you. He glanced at her for a moment, then gave a single nod of acknowledgement but didn't reply directly. His attention returned to the fledgling fire, coaxing it carefully until the flames were large enough to provide real warmth. As the fire crackled to life, the tension that had been holding Eleanor together began to dissolve. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, and she had to fight to keep her eyes open. Kano seemed to notice because he pointed to the skins arranged near the fire. Sleep, he said. Kano, watch. Eleanor wanted to argue that he needed rest too, but the truth was she could barely remain conscious. With slow, exhausted movements, she settled onto the furs, keeping the babies close beside her. The warmth from the fire began to melt the deep chill that seemed to have settled in her very bones, and her eyelids became impossibly heavy. The last thing she saw before drifting into a deep sleep was Kano sitting by the fire, his silhouette stark against the dancing flames, vigilant and watchful despite their exhausting journey. She awoke disoriented with no idea how much time had passed. The fire was still burning brightly, fed with fresh wood that Kano must have gathered while she slept. The babies were also sleeping soundly and peacefully. Someone Kano obviously had fed them with the nourishing broth he had prepared. The Lakota man himself was at the mouth of the cave watching the stone. He had removed some of his outer layers, revealing a lean but powerful torso beneath a finely worked deerskin shirt. In the dim firelight, Eleanor noticed for the first time that the scar on his cheek continued down his neck, disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt. A wound that must have come perilously close to being fatal. As if sensing her gaze, Kano turned to her. "Sleep good," he stated. It wasn't a question but an observation. "Yes," Eleanor replied, sitting up slowly. She felt stiff and sore but immensely better than before. "How long?" "Sun up, sundown," he replied, gesturing outside and then making an arc with his hand toward the unseen horizon. "A full day." She had slept for a full day. The thought was alarming, so many hours unconscious, vulnerable, but it also explained why she felt partially restored. The babies began to fuss, and she worried about how they had fared without her. "Eat good," he reassured her, pointing to a small ball of the nutrient mix he had prepared. "Sleep good." Eleanor nodded, grateful and relieved. She watched Kano move about the cave, tending the fire, checking his supplies, all with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years of living this way, dependent only on himself. "You live alone, don't you?" she asked, her curiosity about this enigmatic man who had saved them growing. Kano seemed to consider the question not because of the language barrier but as if weighing whether to reveal anything at all. "Yes," he said finally. "Long time alone." There was something in his tone, a note of finality that stopped Eleanor from asking more. Instead, she looked more closely at the cave. There were signs of previous use, a small natural shelf in the rock where Kano had arranged some of his belongings, the remnants of old fire pits in the same spot as the current one, even what looked like simple, carved drawings on the rock in a darker corner. "You've been here before," she observed. He nodded. "Many moons. Good place. Safe from stone, safe from other people." "Other people?" Eleanor asked, sensing that his solitude was a deliberate choice. Again that assessing look. "Both," he answered at last. "Soldiers no like Lakota. Some Lakota no like Kano." He paused, searching for the word. "Outsider." The implication was clear. He was an outcast, not just from white society but from his own people as well. A man caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp pang of empathy for him. Was she not also a kind of exile, abandoned by her husband, left to die on the frontier? Now dependent on the kindness of a man who, according to all the stories she'd ever heard, should be her enemy. "I'm alone too," she said softly. "Or I was." She gestured to the babies. Kano's gaze followed hers to the twins. Something softened in his usually stoic expression. "Children," he said, a world of meaning in that simple word. "Children change everything." Eleanor nodded, understanding the profound truth in his observation. The children had changed her world, giving her a reason to live when she had been on the verge of surrender. Kano went to the fire and added more wood. Then he moved to a corner of the cave where he had arranged some small snares and other hunting tools. "Go hunt," he explained, preparing to leave. "Need food." The storm? Eleanor asked, worried about the conditions outside. Less now, he answered, gesturing to the entrance. Snow falls soft. Wind sleeps. Indeed, paying attention now, Eleanor noticed that the constant howl of the wind had diminished to a whisper. Through the mouth of the cave she could see snowflakes falling gently, no longer driven horizontally as they had been during their trek. Be careful, she said, surprised by the intensity of her own concern. Kanu looked at her with an expression that might have been surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to care about his well-being. He nodded once, a gesture that was both a promise and an acknowledgement. As she watched him step out into the white expanse, Eleanor wondered at what point this man, this savage, this Lakota who should have been her enemy according to everything she'd been taught, had become someone whose safety mattered to her so deeply. The babies began to wake, their small whimpers drawing her attention. As she bent to tend to them, Eleanor realized the answer was simple. It was in the moment he had chosen to save them, when he could have turned his back and left them to die. In a world that had turned its back on them both, they had found an unexpected common ground. The will to survive, yes, but also something more fundamentally human. The capacity to see beyond their differences, to recognize the dignity in another. To extend a hand when it would have been so much easier to clench a fist. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, covering their tracks, erasing the past. Inside, the fire crackled, offering not just warmth, but the promise of a future that had seemed impossible only days ago. Eleanor held her children to her chest, breathing in the sweet scent of their small heads. "We are safe," she whispered to them. And for the first time since she'd been abandoned, the words didn't sound like a desperate lie but like a real possibility. "For now we are safe."